Hello, I'm Andrew, and welcome to the next installment in my Sicilian Dragon Masterclass. Today we're going to be taking a look at the classical variation, which occurs after e4, c5, knight f3, the open Sicilian, d6, d4, c takes on d4, knight takes on d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, and now bishop to e2. If you're confused as to how we have reached this position, take a look at the introductory video in this series. If not, stick around. So, bishop to e2 is a little bit of a quiet move on the surface from our opponent. It is very timid, but it is a very respectable line, and we will need to know how to tackle this. White is, of course, indicating to us that they are going to castle kingside. Now, the continuation for black is just to get on with things and play bishop to g7, and after castles and castles, white now has two main moves. They are bishop to g5, which is the most popular at master level, and I would say the most threatening. This is the critical line where we will need to spend most of our time, most likely. And bishop to e3 is the other idea. Now, let's just take a small digression. What if, in a position like this, white plays something else like bishop to e3 now, and we castle, and now they play queen d2? You're thinking, well, this hasn't been included, this particular move order. This is an example of our opponent blending ideas. It's in these kinds of situations where you will need to think on your toes, but the best way to go about things is just to break down why we have played the moves that we've played in the other lines that we've studied. So this looks very much like the Yugoslav variation. So if you were to continue like normal in the Yugoslav variation, you would play knight c6. And now, if your opponent castles, you'll notice, all right, so they've castled. So they've castled instead of the other main line, which is bishop to c4. However, they have spent a tempo on their bishop, developing it to e2. So look around the board and ask yourself, at the cost of what? At the cost of not playing f3, because that's what they should have played before castling, or even before playing bishop to c4 in the main line of the Yugoslav attack. So you ask yourself, okay, well, what does f3 do? It prevents anything from hopping into g4. So where is the weakness in this position? Aha, now I found the move, knight to g4, going after, of course, one of white's best pieces. And once the knight is chopped off on g4 and the bishop takes back, and they do play f3, gaining a tempo on the bishop, well, now we can just keep the bishop pair, drop the bishop back to e6, and we're absolutely fine. Well, aren't we allowing our bishop to be taken here, and won't we be doubling our pawns in that process? Yes, but this is combining another idea that we looked at, where we open up our rook on the f-file, and we have sure protection of the f5 square. So this is how we sort of, when our opponent goes off piece like this, we diagnose where the weaknesses are in their position by applying previous knowledge from things that we have studied very closely. So let's get back to the main line, which is after bishop to g7 and castles, both kings are castled short, so we should not expect loud pawn storms on opposite sides of the board. As I've already mentioned, the key moves here are bishop to g5 and bishop to e3. So let's take a look at bishop to e3. We want to continue with knight c6 here, and as in a lot of lines, if the knight just chops off our knight on c6, then we are totally fine here. We have a strong center. A lot of the central tension has already been diffused. Ideas like queen to c7, the rook will come to the b file, or a rook will come to the d file, and this bishop will find a home sometimes on e6, looking to target this weak pawn, and we'll usually be looking to make breakthroughs on our opponent's queenside. d5 options are also in the air. So this kind of thing isn't particularly challenging. Again, if they play a move like queen to d2, we can just go after this dark squared bishop. Now the dark squared bishop can't leave e3 without hanging the knight, so they would likely need to chop this piece down, and then after a move like f4, well, actually here we can chop the knight off and now play e5, because if f takes on e5, this is actually a little bit of a mistake, because we can capture back, winning a tempo on the bishop, forcing the queens off the board, and now we just have a little bit more of the attacking initiative. We can bring the bishop back to e6, which is an important move because it prevents knight to d5, and then our rooks are going to come to sort of the c and d files. Maybe we're going to want to play a6 to block the knight coming in here, and also to preempt bishop to e3 targeting this weakness. But yeah, we should be pretty happy in this line. So if they decide instead to move the bishop, well, now we can capture, and after rook takes, drop the bishop back to e6, and we just have, yeah, a great game here. Both sides do have an isolated pawn, but we have the bishop pair, and again, our rooks are going to find those nice open, semi-open files. We already have a lot of pressure here, so we can build that up in numerous different ways, and I just prefer black here. Okay, so let's say they don't play queen d2. Let's say they play one of the main ideas, which is knight back to b3. This is a line where actually knight back to b3 does make sense for our opponent, but the idea is going to be the same idea that we play when our opponent plays knight b3 in a lot of the previous lines that we've looked at, which is bishop to e6. We're just looking to develop our rook to the c file. We've got some nice pressure already along this diagonal. Our opponent could respond with something like f4. Now, this is a little bit of a difficult move to remember, but the move here is queen to c8. The reason this is the case is that in the 11-fish variation I talked about, when you have the pawns in a position like this on f4 and e4, e5 is a key idea, but when our bishop is on e6, f5 becomes a lot more threatening. So by moving our queen to c8, it helps form this battery that keeps f5 nice and safe for us. This is not really a threat now that we have so much firepower pointed in its direction. So king to h1 is the master move here. It can be a little bit difficult to understand why, but the reason is that knight g4 is still an idea in a lot of these lines, and going after this bishop would be great for us if we could snap it off the board. This allows the bishop to now drop back to g1, where it would be nice and safe. So here, we just want to proceed by swinging our rook to the center, looking to push d5 and break things open if our opponent isn't taking the initiative. To do that, then we should just go ahead and do it ourselves. Trading off here would not be to our opponent's advantage. We just have too many pieces ready to leap into the game. So what they should do is play e5. Now we're quite happy to hop the knight into e4, because if we see this trade, this pawn is actually not that easy to win back, and we are gaining a tempo on our opponent's queen already due to the position of our rook. So after a move like queen to e1, we can now play f6, and yeah, this is just great for us. If we can trade here, we'll be winning another pawn because we have a lot of pieces pointed towards e5. And if not, I mean, there are some lines where we can even play f5 and just hang on to this pawn and have more space than our opponent, you know, maybe chopping off a piece here and planting a knight on d4. That seems to look pretty good. Okay, so let's say they don't capture the knight. Let's say they add more pressure here with bishop to d3. Well, we still want to play this f6 idea. And notice that if they capture here now, this is just a complete blunder, because when we take, the bishop is now pinned to the queen, so they will be losing a piece. The best they can do here is, you know, take here and think that we, you know, wouldn't do this and utilize this pin again. But they're just going down a piece here. This is not good for our opponent whatsoever. Taking with the bishop is also not a good idea. It's not as much a blunder, because when we recapture, the knight is not pinned to the queen, but the queen is forced to move, and now we can play f5, locking things off, and we just have a great position here. So they shouldn't really be looking to capture in either of these lines on e4. If they capture on f6, we just capture back with the pawn, and one sample continuation is just knight to b5, and now we're locking in that knight in the center. And if they come after our light squared bishop, we just want to move that piece out the way where it's nice and snug. What else do they have at their disposal here? I suppose they could play queen to e1 rather than capturing the piece, but now we are going to force the exchange. And after the knight now takes on e4, notice they can do this because now the bishop is not pinned to the queen. That was one of the ideas behind playing queen to e1. When we recapture and the bishop recaptures, we can now play this very nice move, targeting our opponent's rook. And when the rook moves, we capture the pawn, and after the rook recaptures, this is equal. One sample continuation I've included here is queen to c7 going after the rook, and we're also just looking to exploit the fact that there's maybe an opportunity to pick up this pawn, winning a tempo on this rook. Those are the main ideas. After, bishop to e3. Bishop to e3, we bring the knight out, and if the knight retreats to b3, we bring our bishop to e6, and if f4, we remember to reinforce our f5 square to prevent that push, and if they are masterful and they play a move like king to h1, allowing their bishop to slot back into g1, then we want to continue with a move like rook to d8. Okay, so again, if they don't play this king move here, you should be thinking, all right, how can I get my knight in on g4 to go after their bishop? Well, you can do it more or less immediately because, yes, it's defended twice, but, we're also defending it twice, so we can harass this bishop straight away if they do not play this move, and that is likely to be very good for us because as well as chopping off one of their best pieces, our best piece is really coming alive along the key diagonal there. So, bishop to g5, how about this? This is a really challenging line for black, and the main continuation is knight to c6 that we're going to take a look at in just a moment. But when I look at the Lichess database of games played that are rapid, between the rating of 2000 to 2500, I'm quite surprised to see that actually bishop to d7, just a very quiet move, waiting to see how white is going to commit themselves, has an extraordinary win rate for black. It's about 60%. The same is true for the move queen a5. Of these two moves, I do prefer queen a5. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. With bishop d7, ideas are very simple. Something like queen d2, we develop the knight, and if the knight comes back, we bring the rook across. This is just very solid play, just patiently waiting to see what our opponent is going to do. The reason I like queen a5, actually, is that a very natural move here, and the move that is played more often than not in 32% of games, which is to say only 11 games have reached this position in rapid games in the rating range of 2000 to 2500. But a very natural looking move is queen to d2. Now this is actually a blunder, and the reason is we can grab this pawn on e4. Notice the discovered attack on our opponent's bishop now on g5, so they don't really have much of a choice other than to grab our knight. But now we can force the queens off the board. Remember, we're a pawn up, and look at how the knight now hangs in the center, and we are also threatening to take here. So we just have a great position here. And all because our opponent played what is a very natural looking move, queen to d2. I think the best move for our opponent is bishop to e3 here, but that is quite unnatural and difficult to find, given that you've just developed your bishop to g5 to move it straight back to e3, allowing black almost a free tempo seems quite counterintuitive. So you might want to explore queen a5 or bishop to d7 in your own time, but the main move here is knight to c6. Now, if our opponent captures on c6, we will capture back, and after a move like queen to d2, we can play queen to b6, going after our opponent's pawn. And if they decide to protect their pawns like this, I really like queen to b4 as a move. The reason I like this is it kind of weds the queen to the protection of the knight. We are threatening all kinds of, discoveries on this knight where the bishop would also see through to the rook if the knight were to move. And also it makes bishop h6 ideas a lot more difficult because let's say bishop h6, we just grab the piece, and then they grab it with their queen, okay, but the knight hangs, and and we're getting in this way. So our opponent needs to be very careful. A move like rook a to e1, the a rook to e1, because of course, otherwise this bishop might be seeing things long term that our opponent wouldn't like. And yeah, I've just included one sample continuation with rook to e8, f3, and the knight coming back now to exploit the fact that these squares are now very attractive for us. And notice we are attacking the knight twice. So the knight would need to move back in defense of the queen, because now the queens see each other. But once we trade off pieces, we would be fine. But I've actually included the move A5. The reason I like this is that if they capture our queen, we are now making an A pawn, a B pawn, which is better because it diminishes our drawing chances in the endgame if we can improve one of our pawns ever so slightly. And now the knight comes into the center. I love this position for black. And yeah, I'd be very happy with this in a game. So our opponent doesn't really want to play like that by just chopping the knight off on c6. They would be much better to again play this move, knight to b3. So what do we play? You should be able to remember this by now. Bishop to e6. It's almost an automatic response to knight b3 ideas. I shouldn't say that because there will be some unique positions where it won't be the right move, but it should certainly be a candidate move. Straight away, if you see knight b3 in the dragon, you should be asking yourself, okay, is bishop e6 the correct move? You can also play a6 here, preventing any pieces from jumping into b5, also preparing the move b5 yourself. But after f4 and b5, and now bishop to f3, we can kick this knight and force it to the edge of the board where it's a little bit uncomfortable on a4. But after something like queen to c7, and now c4, and the knight comes back to d7, I just think this is a little bit more comfortable for white to play. Yes, these knights are a little bit awkward, but these bishops are not so awkward, and also these knights are a little bit awkward, and so is this bishop. So you're not losing here, by any means, but I think black can do better in the main line, which is bishop to e6. And now king to h1 again. Well, why king to h1 this time? Because there's no bishop to slot back onto g1, so what could be the idea? Well, the idea is clearly to play f4. Why so clearly? Well, because queen b6 is a recurring motif in a lot of these positions. It's something that black is very likely to play. And if we do play queen to b6, then we would need to waste a tempo playing this later because the pawn would be pinned to the king. Doing this allows for f4, and it allows for us to play, like, even if the queen wasn't already on b6 pinning the pawn, it allows them to play f4 without an immediate queen to b6 check that could, in some lines, be a nuisance. So white preempts this, saying there will be no check along this diagonal, and I'm likely to play f4. Okay, so we play rook to c8, and now after f4, we can bring our knight to the edge of the board, looking to trade off pieces like this. If they go ahead and grab this piece, delightful. This is just fine for us. Our queen seeing across this rank neutralizes these pawn pushes as a threat, because now black has enough there to contend with them. Again, once this knight moves, we're going to see enormous pressure on c3 with our rook staring down the c file as well. This would be great. So our opponent really doesn't want to play this way. They want to go after our bishop and our pawn with an f5 push immediately, because notice now our queen isn't on c8, which makes all of this a little bit more challenging. However, notice that with the knight in position on a5, the bishop has an escape square on c4. There's an idea quite similar to this in some of the Yugoslav lines. We can play bishop to c4 now, and if captures, this is a little bit of a mistake because this just makes the game a lot easier for black. We're already applying pressure here. This just looks like it's going to fizzle out in black's favor. We can strike in the center with d5. I mean, you know, this is an attractive square. There's just a lot going for black, where there is not so much going for white here. This is one sample continuation where we give up the pawn on e7 in order to, you know, get this fork on the queen and the rook. Don't fall for any stupid shenanigans here. You can just bring the bishop back to attack the queen, and when the queen moves, now you can win the rook, and we are great in a position like this. You're unlikely to have to memorize all of those moves. You're probably never going to get that position in a game, but what is important is the key idea here of bishop to c4, and just knowing if they capture, you're going to be fine. So what if they just lock things off, creating this chain with bishop to d3? Well, now you can push b5, anchoring your own bishop in, and bully their knight out of c3. is one sample continuation. And once they've got this solid pawn chain in the center, I would say this looks fairly easy to undermine. We want to rock the knight back now, where it is going to exploit the fact that these squares are becoming softer. And that covers the theory for the main lines in the classical variation. So just a quick recap. Once we reach this position and white plays bishop to e2, we want to play bishop to g7, get castles, castles, and bishop to g5 is the most challenging line, where we're going to play knight c6, and if knight b3, we play e6. Or they're going to play bishop to e3, where we still play knight to c6, and if knight to b3, we are still playing bishop to e6. And once you reach these positions, you should be absolutely fine. Just be sure to memorize some of the key ideas that are a little bit less obvious, such as moving the queen to c8 to reinforce your f5 square. And as a useful heuristic, every time you see knight back to b3, you should always be thinking bishop e6 is a candidate move, at least, if not the best move. I hope you've enjoyed this video. We only have one more critical line left to cover, which is bishop to c4, that doesn't actually have a name, but that I will be calling the javelin variation, so as to make it easier to remember. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you have enjoyed the content. It is a tremendous help. Take care, and as always, I will see you in the next one.